Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to session B-1, Monitoring Test Administration, including Special Populations. My name is Josa, and I'm a program officer within the Office of State Support, or OSS, within the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, within the U.S. Department of Education. And thank you so much for joining the department and your fellow assessment peer reviewers, state assessment directors, Title III and Title I, English learner staff, everyone, just to be a part of this powerful convening where we could exchange ideas and just get to learn from one another. This is awesome. And thank you also for those joining us in the future online. This session is also repeated tomorrow, and I believe it's tomorrow at 10:15. Yes, thank you. So if you want to go to that session, that's perfectly fine as well, and everything will be recorded once again, so it's available for your review at a future date. So for this session, peer reviewers on this panel will discuss the types of evidence that supports the state's demonstration of effective test administration monitoring, both for general test administration and for special populations. Multiple types of evidence that demonstrate monitoring will be described, as well as suggestions for ways that states might better capture evidence of the monitoring that does take place. So this session will specifically address critical elements 2.4, which is found on page 42 of the guide, the bottom, and critical element 5.4, so it's easy to remember, 2.4, 5.4. 5.4 is found on page 64 of the guide. So before we get started, we'll just talk about the critical elements. I'll read the critical elements, and you guys could, if you want, follow along on the guide and look at the examples of evidence, but I'll just really quickly read the requirements, the critical element. So critical element 2.4, monitoring test administration. It says, the state adequately monitors the administration of its state assessments to ensure that standardized test administration procedures are implemented with fidelity across districts and schools. Monitoring of test administration should be demonstrated for all assessments in the state system. The general academic assessments, the general ELP assessments, the alternate assessment aligned with alternate academic achievement standards, and the alternate ELP assessment. So that's critical element 2.4. And 5.4 says, the state monitors test administration in its districts and schools to ensure that appropriate assessments, with or without accommodations, are selected for all students with disabilities and English learners so that they are appropriately included in assessments and receive accommodations that are consistent with the state's policies for accommodations, appropriate for addressing a student's disability or language needs for each assessment administered, consistent with accommodations provided to the students during instruction and/or practice, consistent with the assessment accommodations identified by a student's IEP team under IDEA, placement team convened under Section 504, or for students covered by Title II of the ADA, the individual or team designated by a district to make these decisions, or another process for an English learner. Administered with fidelity to test administration procedures, and finally monitored for administrations of all required academic content assessments, alternate assessment aligned with alternate academic achievement standards, ELP assessments, and alternate ELP assessments. So that was a quick read of the critical elements. And now I'll introduce our distinguished panelists. You guys are all in for a treat. With all of our peer reviewers, they're amazing, they're distinguished, lots of experience. First, we have Dr. Jan Shanker to my immediate left. Dr. Jan Shanker has authored instructional and professional development materials in assessment literacy, standards-based instruction and IEPs, social skills, study skills, metacognition, and policy related to standards, curriculum, assessment, instruction, school improvement, and systems alignment. Jan has designed and conducts studies of alignment of curricula and assessments, provided technical assistance to multiple states on aspects of standards and assessments, and works with several states on all of the above topics and their application to both general and special populations. And I know you guys have your bios in your packets, but this is also for people that are watching us online in the future. To her immediate left is Heather Peltier. Dr. Heather Peltier has served over the past 17 years in a variety of roles in public education, including teacher, literacy coach, psychometrician, Senior Director of Assessment, and her current role as Chief Assessment Officer for the Tennessee Department of Education. Heather has also served as a chair of the Central Florida Assessment Collaborative, a collaboration of school districts working together to develop assessments, as well as the secretary of the Florida Educational Research Association. Heather received her undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia, a master's degree from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and an educational specialist degree from Florida State University. She earned her PhD in curriculum and instruction from the University of South Florida. And finally, we have Dr. Sharon Hall. Dr. Sharon Hall has worked at the federal, state, and district levels. Most recently, Sharon was Director of Summative Assessment Systems for the National Center and State Collaborative General Supervision Enhancement Grant, working in collaboration with 24 states and 5 organizational partners to develop an alternate assessment based on alternate achievement standards aligned with college and career-ready standards. At the U.S. Department of Education, her work focused on the technical quality of states' assessment and accountability systems. In Montgomery County Public Schools, Maryland, Sharon has served as supervisor of special education instruction, pre-K to 12, a staff development specialist, and a classroom teacher in both general and special education in elementary and secondary schools. Sharon has co-authored book chapters, written journal articles, test administration manuals, professional development modules, university courses, and curriculum for students with disabilities. Sharon received her doctoral degree in special education from the George Washington University. So a lot to tap into in this panel, so we're really excited to get started. We've prepared a bunch of questions before we open it up later on to audience questions. So let's get started, and this is a question that's going to be posed to everyone. What evidence have states submitted that peers recommend meet critical element 5.4, monitoring test administration for special populations? And in particular, what have you seen state submissions do well, and why was it done well?
I'm not going to go over anything about test security, but let me just say that test security is very much a part of monitoring of your test administration. Test administration is more than test security, however, and that's being sure that the administration of the test is faithful to the design of the assessment. As you know, there are plenty of pitfalls involved in test administration. Things that you never thought could happen will happen. And there are a million stories that we could tell about that, and Luke could tell the best ones. He always tells the best ones. But let's talk about what are some of the evidence. And what I'm going to talk about in terms of evidence is necessary but not sufficient. So what we typically see that really does hit the mark is the training for test administrators, and usually they will provide pretty comprehensively what their training looks like. What doesn't quite sometimes meet the mark is that it is training only. It really is not professional development. And for those who are not sophisticated in test administration, and surprisingly many of our teachers are not, this becomes a problem in terms of where do you step over the line, when have you stepped over the line in terms of not violating what you're supposed to be doing as a test administrator. So the monitoring begins with the training. It begins with a coherence across all of your documents about what training is to be provided, by whom, how those people are vetted, and that's really important, and how often it's going to be provided, who's going to be responsible to be sure that every single test administrator is adequately trained. And I would say that's something that we see often is missing, where we have a trainer of trainers kind of model, and there's not a checking, a monitoring to be sure that, in fact, that training took place, that everyone involved actually went through the training and in some way demonstrated that they were prepared to give that assessment. So those are some of the kinds of things we see in good quality submissions about the training and about the other thing is procedures for monitoring on site or remotely to determine whether or not someone has put eyeballs on at least a random amount of test administrations. The problem is for states is always the gigantic task of trying to monitor on site actual test administrations, identifying where there are problems and being able to deal with those problems. There should be a set procedure for how do you make sure that those administrations are monitored, for collecting data about how those administrations have been monitored and what actions will be taken when problems arise. I would say that the biggest thing that we see is missing is any evidence that any action was ever taken. I would say that and obviously small State Department staffs have a hard time getting across the whole state and being able to do all of those kinds of things. But those are important if you're going to have a test administration that has integrity and you are going to be able to say to peer reviewers, we actually have monitored, we have a very structured way in which we monitor, we have a very structured way in which we collect the data about that monitoring, and we have things that we do as a result of our findings from that monitoring. The best submissions I've seen is where they actually provide a summary of the actions that were taken as a result of findings from the monitoring. So that's just hitting some of the high points, and I'm sure that Heather and Sharon can add to that.
Thank you. Is this close enough? Okay, good. I have microphone issues. All right, so a couple things that I just wanted to add to this, and my perspective is both coming in as a peer reviewer as well as someone who has been submitting on the state side, so I've kind of got those dual perspectives. One of the things that's really good to see here is really, so some of the submissions that I have seen have had the that kind of assumption that the top-down approach will work. And so it's just, we go out and we put these materials out. In the same way that sometimes, you'll see students or teachers do this with their students. They're like, well, I put the learning out there. And then it may or may not have taken with the kid. That's on them. So really a better quality submission is one that doesn't make those same assumptions. So one that really has a lot of documentation and things like, so for example, rather than just saying, I trained the district testing coordinators and left it to them to monitor, and I'm sure that they did a great job with that they're great. Having very specific guidance for them. So if you're having the monitoring done more at the district level than the state staff, because as you said, some of those challenges with geography or limited state staff size, providing really explicit guidance, like maybe here are some checklists, here are some look-fors, maybe here's how the state is working with the district specifically on the monitoring component, rather than just you attended a training. I made sure they attended a training, and the rest was on them. The other thing that's really nice to see here is if there is a strategy that the state is taking. So, for example, risk-based monitoring. If you are saying we are going to do our monitoring, and it's risk-based monitoring, and so we're looking at maybe past customer service records. So, the volume of calls that are coming in, or things like the volume of reports of irregularity from certain districts. Having really a strategy as far as how you target where the monitoring is going to happen, given that we know that states do have limited resources. So where states can be explicit about here's how we're strategic with the type of monitoring that we're doing, and making that clear. And then yes, as you said, evidence that action is taken. So if monitoring does happen, what happens after that? What if there is a finding? How is that handled? So evidence that the actual monitoring is taking place, not just that the structure is there, that then it does actually happen, and then what happens after the monitoring is over. Thank you.
So I think the way I'm going to share my view of it is encompasses what they've said, but it'll be a different construct. So I'm thinking of what would I see before, during, and after an assessment, such that I could monitor. So you can't monitor stuff if the policy documents aren't there, right? So you want to be sure all the policy documents are in place. For special populations, those would include documents such as participation guidelines, accommodations guidelines, accommodations lists, accommodation manuals, how to administer the various accommodations, specific tests, the test administration manuals, and so forth. So all those documents have to be in place. Then during the assessment, I would want to have the on-site monitoring of the actual test administration. And the criteria that I would want to see would include those pieces that are on your index in 5.4, right? So if you're looking at that document, 5.4 in the middle column and as well as the left-hand column are the evidence or the criteria you need to meet. That's what I'd be monitoring for. So on my monitoring protocol, I'd have those listed. You with me? That way you can't miss it. It's on the protocol. I'd also want to see evidence of desk monitoring because some of those things you won't be able to see on-site monitoring. It might happen at the same time as you're on-site doing the test administration monitoring. But for students with populations, you want to see, I'm just going to give a few examples, that in fact the accommodations that are on the student's IEP or the ELP plan are in fact those accommodations that are being afforded to the student. The student may refuse them, but they're being afforded to the student. That they're in the appropriate test, that a decision in fact was made as to which test the student should take, and so forth. I need to look at my notes. There's a lot here. Okay. Oh, I'd want to be sure that the teachers are aware of the accommodations that the students are supposed to get. So yeah, that's part of their getting them, but the teachers know about it. Was provided the accommodations, process the monitors used to document the observations, the results of the monitoring process, the fact that the monitors are trained in how to observe the test administration and the accommodation administration. So those are things that I would want to see. Then, of course, after the test administration, the monitoring of were there anomalies in the data. That's, there's more to it than that, but that would be one piece I would be looking at for monitoring.
Oh, thank you all. That's a lot, and it's necessary but not sufficient. I heard a lot about training, by whom, how's vetted, how often. The actions are crucial, not just the inputs, but what you do with the outcomes and what actions have been taken after that. You don't just assume that things will be done, but you follow through and you actually monitor, take a very comprehensive approach before, during, after, and you invest the stakeholders that are necessary so that you could move forward. In terms of the next question about how evidence of monitoring might differ for different types of assessments. So we talked about in the critical elements, the various assessments, the general ELP assessment, the general academic assessments, the alternate assessments for English language proficiency, and just the alternate achievement standards assessment. How does evidence of monitoring differ among those different types of assessments, or does it?
My answer to that is it really shouldn't, but and I think that this is something that's going to take some real effort to see happen. There should be a consistent, when I talked about coherence before, I was talking about more than just coherence across your documents for your general assessment and coherence between across your alternate and your ELP assessments. I'm talking about coherence across all of those documents. One of the things that we have struggled with is having all of our people trained together to a common understanding of what assessment is, how it is administered, how we understand its meaning, what does standardization of administration mean. I believe the only way that that's ever going to happen is if everybody is at the same table. And that means the general educator, the special educator who both does the general education with accommodation, and those who do the alternate assessment and the alternate ELP. And this is a mistake I really don't want to see ELP have to put their foot in every mistake that we made on the alternate assessments. We've learned a lot in the last 20 years, and I think I've seen some improvement. And I really don't want to go back and start over. So one of the key ways to avoid that is to have a common expectation for how you are going to monitor your assessments. Everybody's trained in that consistent way of monitoring, the expectation that they are accountable to a faithful administration, and it's not a case of, oh, that poor little kid, he's not, because the truth of the matter is you do the child a disservice when you do not, when you're not consistent and standardized in the way that you administer the assessments. So that, to me, there's not a difference. I think it needs to be consistent across all of those different ways of assessing.
You can actually go next.
Okay.
That way we don't
Okay.
jump in.
We'll hop around. We'll change it up here. So some things I would say, I agree with what Jan's saying. The documents are going to be similar, but they need to be different too. So sometimes I've seen training modules across the tests that look pretty much the same and don't specify the specific test. So for a general assessment, the academic content assessment, you're using different names. That's why I'm stumbling a little bit now. It's going to be different from a test administration for an alternate assessment because of the nature of the population. They're going to need augmentative communication devices. They're going to need brailing and just various differences. So those documents are going to be different, and they need to look different. So the test administration manuals, all that stuff beforehand, the state policy documents will be different. I think it's important that the training for the monitors will be different in that, which makes sense. The types of accommodations, if it's an online assessment versus a one-on-one assessment, you've got to see those protocols for how to do that in the test administration manuals. Otherwise, it's hard to monitor how it's supposed to be given if those protocols aren't there. I'm speaking specifically of accommodations.
Yeah, I was making a distinction between administration and monitoring.
So I agree with all that, and I think one of the things as peer reviewers we all can agree that we do want to see kind of one common comprehensive monitoring plan, and then in terms of the logistics and how that might look, it might look a little bit different. So for example, with alternate assessment, if you've got your monitoring checklist that you're going out and monitoring the administration, the type of access that teachers have to the materials or their interaction with the students and materials looks very different than it might for the general education assessment. And so just having those nuances there, but then having it included as part of that one plan, I think is something that we've all been asking for, because we don't want each one treated as if it were a brand new event or something in isolation.
Yeah. And Sharon, I know you touched on accommodations, and this next question touches upon what evidence can states submit to document that test accommodations for each specific student population are administered with fidelity.
Okay, so the accommodations as well as the test?
Sure.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear. Okay, so the accommodations, so a lot of the evidence is going to come from, this is all the before testing stuff. Okay, so all those policy documents, your test administration manual would have your accommodations list. Hopefully, or you need to have how to administer the accommodations such that the test is valid and reliable for the student. So you can't just say read aloud. There's ways to read aloud that don't signal the correct response. You're aware of these things. Or how do you scribe? You know, there are protocols. There should be at least a page long of how to take a scribed response, both for selected response and constructed response. When the student is using different types of assistive technologies, how does, you know, what's that involved? If the student's using a computer and they need a scribe to do that, they can't respond online. So without those spelled out protocols of how to administer the accommodation, you can't monitor appropriately for that. So I would see in the protocol for monitoring those specifics about how to administer a read aloud and the scribe. Those two, I think, are the two accommodations that are most likely to be administered in such a way that a response, the correct response is indicated. That's been my experience. You know, the teacher reads aloud, is it A, B, C, or D? Okay, that kind of thing. And that's what you're monitoring for. So the monitor has to be trained in how to listen for that, how to observe that. And then I do want to say, sorry, not yet. After the test administration, of course, those data analyses, you know, what happens? Are there findings from data reviews, from the technology, anomalies in scores? So if some classrooms, and you've experienced this in your districts or states, some classrooms, you know, they're 100%, but all those students got read aloud. So that would be something to examine. Maybe everything's fine and maybe it's not. Something to examine. It's a tip-off. And were accommodations that were not on the student's IEP and ELP plan provided, and that could invalidate an assessment.
And actually, to speak to your second point that you just made, that was kind of where I wanted to go, is a protocol for handling how to administer the assessments with accommodations, but also protocols for dealing with what happens when the accommodations maybe are not followed, because we all know that happens in the real world, right? Students are supposed to be given an accommodation and they're inadvertently denied it, or students are not supposed to be given an accommodation and they're inadvertently given it. And so just making sure the documentation has protocols for how to deal, you know, how both of those situations might be handled, you know, whether obviously there are going to be some kind of case-by-case basis things, but kind of just general guidance that's out there that your department is using to monitor that.
This kind of goes to, I was really making a distinction between procedure and administration. Obviously, a person who's going to monitor is going to be trained in the administration. But what I've seen is that the procedures have differed so widely that they leave kind of gaping holes depending on which assessment you're talking about. This goes to, though, one of the things that I think is really critical that we don't see a lot, and that is when you're doing on-site monitoring, everybody does their own. So general ed sends their own team, special ed sends their own team, those who are doing alternate send their own. Really, to do a comprehensive monitoring, you need to send a team. And that team needs to represent those three kinds of assessments that you're looking for. Same procedures, different expectations, depending on what they're looking for specifically, and they will know what to look for because they've been trained in what the expectations for the administration are, with or without assessments or with alternate assessments. And again, states have a hard time with that because of that's very labor intensive. But there are some other ways that are becoming more available to us in monitoring as a result of the technology, and I think we're going to talk about that a little later.
Yeah, for sure. I guess we'll talk next about the technology, maybe. We'll just skip on to that. How might evidence for these critical elements differ for computer-based assessments versus paper-based assessments? For example, add on to that is what opportunities exist. Maybe I'll circle back to that. What evidence might these critical elements, how might it differ for computer versus paper? The evidence.
I, I have seen this happen, but this is pretty rare at this point, but it's sort of future thinking. First of all, the first contact and LCI surveys allow the test administrator to enter pre-test exactly what the student is supposed to get in terms of accessibility, tools, and accommodations. And the good news is that so much of what we used to call accommodations have now become accessibility tools, and depending on your state, they're generally available to any student who takes that assessment. In a couple of states, they are able to draw down the data from that database and to match what actually gets turned on in that database for that particular student and therefore available to that student. So that if it's electronic, they've already got a body of evidence about what students actually got in the administration of the assessment that matches what they were supposed to have gotten in their IEPs. A couple of states also follow that up for those accommodations that they cannot monitor based on a match between what they were supposed to have gotten based on the first contact or LCI survey and what they actually got in the assessment. And those are paper and pencil, other kinds of test administrator assisted accommodations, communication systems, and that sort of thing. They have a checklist that every test administrator will fill out post-administration to determine those additional checks on what the student actually got versus what they were supposed to get. And I want to just address one of the things that Sharon said about they refused the accommodation. One of the things that I'd like to see in test administration monitoring is a question about whether they really refused it or they just didn't get it. Because this is something I don't think we followed up very cautiously about. And I think the evidence, at least from a couple of states that I've worked with where parent complaints have indicated that it wasn't that the student refused it, it was that it was not offered to the student, that we need to do a better job of keeping track of that. But I think we're going to more and more see with the technology the opportunity to really match up what the student was supposed to get with what the student did get. And that's really like a whole new world.
And for this question, I'm actually going to talk maybe a little bit less about accommodation and more about kind of the general monitoring, the 2.4, I think. And I just wanted to talk about maybe some of the opportunities that are out there whenever the assessment is computer-based rather than paper-based, because suddenly there comes a lot more data that is available for the state to use. And so hopefully in the submissions that would be reflected in terms of that monitoring plan. So for example, as the students are testing online, how many times are their answers changing? The average length of time spent testing, maybe the average testing time per item. So just evidence that that the state is actually looking at some of these new metrics that are now available because it's computer-based testing rather than paper-based testing. And then kind of to tie back to the other, some of the similar things we would expect to see is then, so first of all, that plan, what are you looking at, how are you looking at it? And then the second step, though, is then what are the actions that might be taken after this? If you were noticing maybe some alarming patterns, high degrees of reports of irregularity in certain areas, or maybe, as you said, maybe accommodations are not, maybe the accommodations that you're seeing entered into the system are not aligning with what you're seeing in the students' IEPs. That might be something that we would then want to see, hopefully, some sort of action that's taken, like that next step. So you've gathered all this data, you've looked at the data, and now the state has actually got a plan for what to do with this data, how to use it.
The piece I'd add to the technology is also looking at when the test was administered. So was it administered at 6 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon Eastern time? That would suggest that that's not an appropriate test administration. And the length of time when the window was open, the test was open on a computer. could be an indicator of, I'm not sure. Maybe the student did need 2 hours to take the test. That's feasible. If not, though, was that window left open and not shut, such that, you know, the security of the assessment has been violated or has been, violated.
I'll just add one thing, and that is with the computerized IEPs. I've seen a couple of states do this where they are able to match what was in first contact or the LCI with the computerized IEP, what accommodations they were supposed to get for assessment. And again, that's data heavy, so it always helps to have some real data geek in your department to do that sort of thing. But this is really convincing information for peer review that you are monitoring these things and that you have evidence that you are in fact monitoring them.
In terms of those opportunities, are there any data pieces that you wish were collected currently that isn't, and I think you may have spoken to this or touched upon it lightly, but any pieces of data or evidence that you wish we collected but we don't collect currently?
Well, several of the pieces that we have referred to are not collected currently by many states, so.
Yeah. Agreed.
Fair. So then we'll shift over to challenges. So this is a grand question, so it doesn't need to be the single biggest challenge, but what is the single biggest challenge for states in submitting evidence on this particular topic area or critical element of monitoring test administration for the general and special populations, or just challenges in general that you've seen in submissions? And I'll follow through.
I'll just say a few things because I know you have lots of things to say. That there's no data validation or no suggestion that there's actual monitoring taking place. That yes, we do that. We have trained monitors, and we're going to do this, and some selected LEAs will be monitored. But it's very high-level thinking. It's not a specific plan, a specific schedule, a specific protocol. It's the intention of, but with no lack of evidence.
Yeah, I would say for this, it goes back to that whole, sometimes the submissions that we've seen seem to be more of a don't ask, don't tell policy. We train the districts. We're pretty sure they're doing what we told them to do. Hope for the best. And so in this, I think in this case, it's really nice to get rather more weedy here. As you said, like we've got plans, we've got checklists, we've got actual look-fors. Here are the things. Here's the monitoring team. Here's who's actually on that monitoring team. Here's evidence of where they visited in the past. Maybe a plan for how they're going to make their visits in the future. Specific guidance. Because so I know some states in their submissions do actually not have state teams that do that. I've seen submissions where it is purely done at the district level. In that case, really, again, like in the weeds, clear specific guidance for your districts then. All right, what type of evidence are you collecting? How are you making sure that it's actually being monitored? And then how as a state are you working with the districts to, maybe you're doing some audits of the materials they've collected, or maybe, you're just kind of talking it through with them, but something that shows that you're actually then going that step further and working with them, and it isn't just that, don't ask, don't tell. We're pretty sure everything is going fine. And then, let me see what else. Yes, I think, I think the earlier point that, I can't remember, one of you had mentioned was the evidence that the monitors themselves have been trained is also really important. You've got the materials, and then you've got evidence that you've trained those monitors so they know how to appropriately use and apply those materials.
I think to summarize what we've been saying is trust but verify. There's a lot of trust going on out there. There's also a lot of plan going on. And I think that, as Sharon alluded to, what the real challenge, I think, is for us to really provide evidence of the data we've collected and the actions we've taken per monitoring. I think one of the things that troubles me the most is when I see states saying, we're going to do on-site visits on this schedule, and it is very clear that a district is going to get monitored about once every 10 years, which means that a student will go through his entire career, and we will never know if in that particular school the test was actually administered with fidelity. So I think we need to find multiple ways to monitor, not just the on-site monitoring, to try to verify. But again, we can trust, but we need to verify.
Yeah, so that hands-off approach, the don't ask, don't tell, top-down, that's all seems to be a no good thing to do. What is the most often noted piece that's missing? Missing evidence that states don't have or haven't provided enough evidence for these particular critical elements? Things that you wish you spoke about it, but wish you saw, but they just didn't quite go there. And I know we also talked a lot about maybe not the extreme cases, but ones where it seems like they've planned it out, there wasn't any follow through, or they did the bare minimum, or you don't even know if that's there. But for states and consortia that actually did provide all of that, how can they make their submissions better? How can they improve upon their submissions? And what's missing that you wish you saw?
Well, I'm going to go to the organizational standpoint versus the content, but I'm going to move to the process of developing the peer review submission. So if you're looking at 5.4, you'll see that there are a plethora of sub-bullets, right? And so in the second column, when you have your index, you're going to have the left-hand this is your left-hand side with the critical element, and then the middle column is going to be empty. This is on the thing you're writing on. So what I would love to see is states to organize that evidence such that it's accessible to the peers. And the way I would do that is for each of those subcomponents of the critical element, place a header in that middle column that says a participation criteria for alternate assessment. And then underneath it, you're going to say the the participation guidelines, page, blunk, whatever it is. Are you with me on that? Break out those sub-criteria so you're not just dumping participation manual, TAM, this and that, and a bunch of page numbers. Break it down by the subcomponents of the critical element. That would be so helpful. And you want us to find the evidence, right? That's the point. It's not a treasure hunt. You want us to find the evidence. So help us do that. You have the evidence. States have this. Just tell us where it is.
And actually, to go to that, in terms of helping the peers find the evidence, one of the things I found that is, I think, really simple and easy, but that makes it easier for me as a reviewer, is the naming protocol that is being used for the pieces of evidence. So some states will call us, evidence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And then you'll see in this category, you've got, refer to evidence 1, 208, 7, 42, done. And it's, as a peer, I think it's really hard because you're kind of trying to skip through and figure out where each one is. If the naming protocol somehow incorporates the actual critical element, so for example, 5.4.1, 5.4.2, 5.4.3, then it makes it a lot easier. They're kind of then clustered together naturally for me whenever I'm reviewing them so that I can see at a glance. Or maybe you've omitted, because sometimes this happens, someone will actually have submitted a piece of evidence that there's no reference to in the document. But if based on the naming protocol, I can tell this is for critical element 5.4, now I can go in and find that and give the state credit for that rather than just saying, there's this mysterious 87-page document and I don't really know where it goes or what they were intending us to look at here.
Well, I'm going to talk about something that we haven't talked about before, and that's borrowed documents. We all like to see what everybody else is doing and what we can duplicate. However, for those of us who've been around a lot, it looks like a borrowed document. That is, I don't want to discourage you from borrowing strategies and methodologies from other states, because we do have some real exemplar states that we really want to use. CCSSO provides some great monitoring models for us, and other organizations. So I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying those are meant to be models. You need to adapt those to what you're doing in your state, and that is a violation of coherence when you do not do that. All of your documents need to be coherent with what your state is doing, and that means when you use those models, you need to make it clear how those things are being done in your state. Yeah, I don't think changing the state name.
Sometimes
Us
it's not
old
changed in a
people
document.
have seen this before.
Well, and sometimes the state name from the provider state hasn't been changed in the document.
Right, that's true.
You know, so it's a real tip-off.
That's true. So just including one of those documents and slipping it in, that doesn't work very well.
Right. Which I think is not to give the impression, though, that you need to reinvent the wheel every time. Like, there's certainly nothing wrong. If you see some exemplary forms or something, please, I think as a peer reviewer, by all means, I would say, go ahead and borrow and use it. Just make sure that it's actually what you're borrowing and what you're using actually does fit your state and doesn't have maybe elements that have no relation to what you're doing whatsoever. It just happened to be in the document that you borrowed. But yes, this is not to say that you can't borrow or should have to reinvent the wheel.
Right, and I think what we see sometimes is at the last minute, whenever you're getting ready to submit peer review, you realize you have a gap and you borrow something and stick it in. That's what we don't want to see.
All right. Wow, that I did not know you guys see that. Is there anything else we should know about these
This
submissions?
audience that will
Wow. That was just okay. I guess that's a good signal that we should open it up for audience questions. We have about 29 minutes remaining. Any questions that you may have? If not, we could ask our panelists to think of some questions. I'm sure they have questions as well. But I saw a hand, perhaps, somewhere from the audience. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so Mark Weinstein, Caveat Test Security. I have two questions. One question, and hopefully everyone else has an interest in these issues as well. One question is there a magic number in terms of the quantity of schools that should be monitored by a state, under these standards? So, I mean, I can think of a state that has 4,200 schools, right? For monitoring to be meaningful, do they need to monitor 1%, 2%? Is there a magic number?
There isn't a magic number, and what we were really suggesting is that you need to have more than one strategy for monitoring. And what we've seen a lot is single strategy kinds of approaches, particularly I think in special education and monitoring of accommodations, where they have a schedule of on-site monitoring. So what we're suggesting is that you need multiple strategies for monitoring your assessment. A decision about what is a critical mass in terms of on-site monitoring, I personally don't have an answer for. Maybe someone else, one of the other peer reviewers or a number of them in the audience might have an answer to that.
And I think it's doubtful, sir, that the department's going to say how many schools or districts must be monitored. They're going to leave it up to the state. And so I think if I were in the state, I'd ask my TAC what would be
Good strategy.
reasonable to do. And would imagine I'd want to sample each district. Again, depending on the size of the district. If it's a one-school district, you're not going to do that every year, perhaps. I mean, I'm saying some obvious things. What other strategies have you all used? Let's get them out here. Let's share. I mean, has what we said make sense about how many to monitor, or what guidelines do you all use? Is that okay, Joe?
Yeah,
if I'm
of
doing
course,
that?
absolutely. That's
What do
we
you
should be
use?
doing.
What do you do?
Yes.
Nancy from the Maine Department of Education. I'm not going to answer your question because I don't have a strategy. So the assessment team in the Maine Department of Education consists of 2 people. I do the general assessments, and we have an alternate assessment coordinator. I oversee 3 different assessments. It's me. It's just me. So I'm not sure how I'm doing this monitoring, and I'm relying a lot on the honesty of the schools and the districts to report that they're following their IEPs, they're giving the accommodations that the students are needing. But you were talking about training monitors. If that's something that I'm supposed to do at district and school levels, is there a exemplar template of how to train monitors?
Well, to me, the way to train the monitor would be based on the protocol for monitoring, as well as which would include the test administration manual, what should it look like, what are the requirements, what are the participation guidelines, and so forth. So anything that's in the test administration manual is what the monitor should be able to observe and should be trained on, as well as knowing that what they see is okay or not okay.
What I think has been more successful, and I hate to say that I've rarely seen this, but is when the teams are not test or assessment department only. When you engage other, like the content people in the monitoring, and you engage special education people in the monitoring, they become more invested in the quality of the assessment because they're out there seeing what's going on in the test administration. So I know that's tough. We really like those silos, but that's the kind of effective monitoring that takes place is when you cross departments.
Sounds good. It looks good on paper.
And it does look good on paper. I just want to add to, if your state has sometimes, some states, like I know Tennessee has regional offices, that you can
Yes.
engage maybe those regional offices. And sometimes having actually peer review as it might be an incentive to get them, maybe if they have been reluctant to participate in the past, and you can say, hey, this is something our state actually needs for the peer review process. So sometimes this can be used as a little bit of leverage to engage maybe other teams in the assessment process that maybe might not have been as motivated in the past. But the other thing I want to add was one of the questions that came out of the first session I was in was whether there might be a vehicle for how we could, as states, share some of these resources. So as you were talking about, these checklists or maybe some of the training materials, if states have something like that developed that you can share, here's our monitoring checklist, here's how we train our monitors to do that. So I know that is something that I think Mario is going to be talking with Donald and looking into assisting us with, because that I think would be a really good opportunity. As you said, some states have larger teams, some states have smaller teams. It's hard for anyone to have to struggle alone and reinvent the wheel.
Do you also use, do you have local accountability coordinators, ma'am, from Maine? No. So maybe that's something to think about, what other supports in the field can help with the test administration and, rolling out those materials to the field so it's not dependent on the state. Who are your representatives in the field? Are there systems that could be developed?
Hi, I'm Maxie Moore from the state of North Carolina, and we do have regional accountability coordinators that go out and train the local LEAs on how to administer the tests, but then there are also some of our monitors. And we do have a monitoring checklist, and we do have a percentage of schools that they need to go and specific LEAs to go and monitor. But how schools get on that list varies. One way is looking at data, especially looking at irregularity reports. If there happens to be more in one area than another, then we may happen to descend upon that school, or looking at data irregularities. We may pop in there not one day, but maybe 2 or 3 days, because sometimes, and they don't know that we're going to always be there. So we look at a variety of ways to go out and monitor, and we've also had discussions this year about how do we get other people from within the department to go out, like you were saying, can we rely on some of our EC folks, our EL folks to be able to go out and monitor? And sometimes we don't want those regional accountability coordinators actually going to the schools that they end up training. So we try and go across regions so that they're not monitoring the schools that they had trained. So those are just a couple suggestions and things that we have used that are working, yet we're still always looking for other ways to monitor to make sure that we're hitting the security things.
I just had a question. We've been thinking about this whole idea that's new that we've heard, that's kind of new to us, is that idea of forensic examining, test results and doing, what is it called? Somebody had called it a cheat report, but we didn't think that was appropriate language to use for that. Maybe an anomaly report or something. But because we are a small state, there's 3 of us in our division, an assessment director, me, and a secretary. So we've been trying to figure out how to make monitoring happen. And one of the things that's nice about peer review is that we've got support from leadership now because of peer review and saying this is really important. So we're going to have some people that we train that'll help us. We've enlisted our special education division to help us with the accommodations piece. But is there any guidance on what an anomaly report would look like and how that could play into monitoring for our districts? Because I know we want to look at more of the part that we get from having technology or online assessments. We want to look at more of the things that we can do back at the office to identify districts where we need to go and visit. Oh, and I'm Yvonne Field. I'm from Montana.
Yeah. I've seen that the vendor, Yvonne, the technology vendor can run those reports and provide them to you. What's another answer from states who have online assessments? Is that who runs the
Lou could
test
probably help us with
discrepancies?
that.
Yeah.
One more thing about that I had questions about is there a general guideline for what should be on that report? Is that just something that there's sort of there's a template for that already? So if we asked for it, it would be clear what we're looking for.
Those are pretty standard.
Okay.
Lou could contribute to that.
Well, a couple of things. Lou Fabrizio, formerly with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, now independent consultant. As far as those reports, whether they're called cheating reports or any of that kind of stuff, the big thing that we want to see in peer review is what did you do based on what you found out in those reports? Did you investigate? Did you, bring certain teachers who did unethical things? Did they get their license revoked? Some little summary of what you did with it. What I didn't hear anyone talk about when you were talking about the training of test administrators is in some of the stuff that I've seen where they have a vendor or it's a consortium, the state would say the consortium offered all of this training material, but then it never said whether the state followed up to see did the test administrators actually go through that training, So it's one thing to say we have all of this available stuff, but did you check to make sure that anybody did anything with the available stuff?
Yeah, that's good. And that if it's online training, that there is an assessment for the test prior to the test administrator being allowed to administer the test. They have to pass the training with a certain type of score. Now, I'm seeing these folks from Caveat, and I know that's the work you do, right? So do you have some comments?
Well, yes. So in terms of, sorry.
Remember, it's being recorded, so if you speak on the microphone, we don't know who you are, what the question was. So please bear with us.
Quick comment, please.
Go for it.
Sure. We're talking about statistical analysis of test response data, right? So yes, Caveat does that for numerous states, working with numerous, major test publishers as a subcontractor to those publishers, and we produce reports that show all different kinds of possible things that could have happened. But the reality is that
The statistics only tell you that something unusual occurred, and it is up to the state to follow up to figure out what the causes of the statistical anomalies are. And one of the strongest ways to understand what's happening in a place that is generating statistical anomalies is to go watch them administer a test. I mean, it's really compelling, and there are quite a few states where we work where we, assist the states in essentially coming up with a plan for how to follow up on the statistical anomalies. And sometimes it's monitoring. In many cases, it's monitoring. The truth is, it's uncomfortable to investigate, but we also assist states with investigations. And talking to students about what happened during testing is a really easy thing to do. It makes teachers and administrators uncomfortable, the kids less so, and the kids will tell you, because I've interviewed probably hundreds of kids at this point, and they will tell you, oh no, the teacher said try again. I mean, they don't think anything about it. So, oh, okay, so maybe that's why we have so many response changes from incorrect to correct. And it's even better when the teachers get it wrong, and we have so many matching incorrect responses. So, I mean, it's not really better. I just, just making the point. None of that's good. None of it's not great that it's happening, but there are solutions to follow up on it, and the data is a great place to start, but it is a start. It's not the end.
Thanks, Mark. Steve?
Oh, thanks, Joe. So I've been writing about test security quite a lot in the last couple of years, and I want to add on to what Mark just said. When you get to the point where you have to investigate, you have to make a decision about whether you're going to ask someone in a district to do the investigation or whether you need professional help with investigations. And the reason I say that is some low-level kinds of things like administration irregularities or errors, a local, a district assistant superintendent could do an effective investigation of something like that, but they inherently have a conflict of interest. They don't want to find trouble in their own district. So even if they don't have an actual conflict of interest, they have an appearance of one, which is problematic for the quality of your investigation. In addition to that, when there's a high stakes investigation required, educators, all of us, we're not trained investigators. If you look at the ONET job skills, knowledge, skills, and abilities for investigators and compare them to the knowledge, skills, and abilities for educators, they're diametrically opposed. So if you have a high stakes situation, you need professional investigation help. So let me stop there.
Thank you. I think we will go to Pietro, and then I think I saw one lady with the question. Any other questions in the house?
Yes, just remember to identify yourself when you speak on the phone and state your question.
And make sure the microphone is, close to your mouth. Yes.
Okay, this is Pietro Smafero from Michigan, continuing the same topic. We've usually found that the superintendents do a good job of nailing their own people to the wall because they're really worried the state will come in and do it if we don't. So we do get back sometimes, they've interviewed the students, or we get hundreds of pages of report of, yeah, we had to fire a principal. And the threat of us showing up has usually been pretty good for getting them to watch themselves. For us on monitoring, we have roughly 3 layers of it. The one we're working on improving now is data analysis. We don't have what should be accommodations given based on a 504 IEP plan. We just get at the state a note they do have one. So we're following up with some schools, because if you have 1 or 2 students who got accommodations without an IEP plan at all, okay, something probably, you didn't file your IEP plan on a form. If you have 50, someone probably checked the box for give all my students read this aloud. That could be bad in terms of they were being a bad actor, or they just didn't know what is the right box to check. We do random monitoring. We have a large office, but we still contract that out. That's how you get the bodies, especially because we have the SAT as our high school exam. We don't have enough bodies to monitor the entire state taking the SAT. So we've contracted that out. We do the same with our data analysis. We contract that out. We have a couple psychometricians. They don't have the time to do all that dive. And then we have the targeted monitoring, where we do have our investigators, because our favorite thing to do for that is every school who messed up last year gets monitored this year. They're on a targeted list. And we have 2 people on contract for that, a retired academic assessment expert and a retired state police detective. And if we actually have to go to a real investigation, those are the 2 we call to go send out to talk to the school. Send in a cop and an academic.
Okay, any comments from the panel? All right, we have about 10 minutes remaining. If there are any questions, in addition to the useful suggestions and comments, any questions? I think one lady back there.
There's one in the center.
And right behind the obstruction. Okay, great. Awesome. Please identify yourself, name.
Nancy Godfrey from Maine. Accommodations that students should have that they didn't get versus accommodations that they were assigned but they didn't use. That's my question. Do you have a position on, say, Johnny has a scribe because he usually gets scribe in the classroom and so on, and it's in his IEP or 504. If come the day of the assessment, Johnny is raring to go and wants to write his own answers, my philosophy is you can't force Johnny to have the scribe, and you're not going to grab the pencil from him and not let him write or type his answers. Is that okay?
Well, at least one, it is, but at least one state that I know of checks back on that to be sure that's exactly what did happen. Because of the reason that I mentioned earlier, and that is there have been instances where it wasn't a case of the student refusing the accommodation, it was a case of it not being offered.
It didn't happen, right?
Yes.
I would also suggest the teacher document that was in fact the case. I would have a date and a time and exactly what the student said on that documentation.
Documented where?
On a piece of paper, and to give it. No,
Well, when
that,
the
or
check
if
back
there's,
occurs, then they have that information.
yeah, or give it to the principal, after the tests are collected. So, I mean, somehow that needs to be part of the record.
So I will say for what we're doing in my state is, because we've had this problem that I mentioned earlier where students who should have had accommodations were not given them, or students who should not have had accommodations were given them. In the case of a student who should have had an accommodation that was not given it, we have clear guidance that we provide to the district testing coordinators that then they share out to the building testing coordinators and the test administrators, and we include in our trainings available for all of them to say specifically, here's how you handle the situation, and in all cases they have to reach out, contact the parent, let the parent know they have to document that, they have to save that, preserve that in the student's cumulative folder, and that is all specified in the documentation that we give them so that they know exactly how to handle it. And we tell them it's also for your own protection, so there's not a lawsuit down the road where the parent says or student says something was denied them.
Right. In some instances, where states have those procedures, and I highly recommend that, they have a procedure that says if they cannot demonstrate that it was the child declining the accommodation, that test will be invalidated.
Great. We have one more question in the back.
Hi, Ray Clements, Illinois. I have a question about monitoring specifically students who are outplaced, both to public special education facilities and non-public education facilities. We have a lot of those in Illinois, and those facilities sometimes have different philosophies on what it means to assess their students. And the appropriateness of the exam with or without accommodations. And so I was just wondering what kind of guidance you've seen in the monitoring of how different states have handled that situation.
Is some of that in state regulations? I'm not sure that there might be something in state regulations that requires oversight, or that every student in a non-public school or a whatever school has to da-da-da, and then that gives you the permission to enter the school and do such monitoring. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, it's a what?
It's a federal requirement. If the local school district's IEP team says that this child needs to be provided services at a private school, then that child has to be tested
Must. Must.
We've certainly had cases where the lawyers get involved to fight that particular fight out. So there are differing interpretations of that requirement, apparently.
Wow. So, and there might, if there are federal regulations, this would be something you could contact the U.S. Department of Education to cite those regulations and laws to you, so you can have those at for your use. But fight the fight. Do what's right for students.
It's must, yeah. Any questions? Other questions? Yes.
I just have one quick one. Catherine Altmeyer, Florida. You mentioned that you liked the idea of when we submit including the criteria element in the file name. I went to the assembling submission panel earlier today, and they actually said the exact opposite. That there are too many criteria elements oftentimes, so that instead it's just necessary that your naming convention, evidence one, test administration manual or something like that, and then you cite. So it's just indicative to me of how sometimes it's confusing that you don't know how to best help, which we obviously want to do, but different people seem to want different things.
So I will say this is one of the things that that I've experienced both being in peer reviews and being on the receiving end of peer review feedback. Sometimes the type of feedback that you're getting, or it's sometimes entirely dependent on the preferences of the panel, which is, I think, rather unfortunate, because we would like to think, we've got these standardized expectations. Let's adhere to them. But yes, I have experienced some variation in terms of what the preferences are and what the requests are. Agreed.
I think we had a perfect example when we were talking about monitoring. We bled over into test security. So your documents are going to have multiple applications. So the recommendations you received in your earlier session, I think, make a lot of sense.
We have about 4 more minutes. So if there are any other questions, please speak now or forever hold your peace. Any other ones before we head back to Mark? Okay, Mark, it's you.
So, one of the challenges, hello?
I guess so
Test. Okay. One of the challenges that I think some states are having is with monitoring of the alternate assessment. My understanding and experience is that this is frequently a one-to-one administration, and the students, by virtue of being qualified to take the alternate, obviously have many challenges, and having another person in the room, literally present in the room during the administration, can in and of itself become an obstacle to a valid administration of the alternate exam. How do you suggest states deal with that challenge?
Well, perhaps there's, I think there are a bunch of ways. One would be the placement of the person. Maybe they are not visible, but they can hear it. Maybe it's a 3-way window. I've seen some schools have what's it called? It's not a 3-way window. Oh, 2-way window. Okay. Observation room where the test is administered, and that way the student, the teacher, outside of the rest of the classroom anyway, and there's an observer there. So those are 2 thoughts.
Great.
I would also be very careful of generalizations, because that is not always the case, and I think it's kind of a go-to excuse that may not always apply, and I think it many times does not apply.
That the student would be sensitive to an observer.
Right.
Okay. So a case-by-case determination for the student.